Okay, let's start our study of biology with studying the basic characteristics of life and why we consider the cell the smallest unit of life. So in the picture here, we see several different examples of living organisms. At the top left, we have a microscopic view of some algal cells or algae. And then at the bottom left, we have a petri dish with some bacterial cells growing in colonies. And then at the top right, we have some plant tissue, plant species. And then at the bottom right, of course, we have animal species. Now, what we're going to do today, we're going to go through several what we consider properties or characteristics of things that we consider living. So there's several of those. We'll go one by one, talk about some examples. One thing I want to highlight that we'll mention several times through the lecture today is the cell is what we would consider the smallest unit that something is living. And some organisms consist of really only one single cell, but other organisms like us are multicellular and are made up of many millions or billions of cells. Now, viruses we do not consider living. They are not made of cells, and they do not have several of the properties or characteristics of life that we'll talk about later. Now, when we look at the big picture and we say, okay, well, if the cell is the simplest unit of life, are all cells the same? And no, they're not. And we basically look at cells in two main categories. Now, obviously, as we go through the semester and as you continue your study in biology, you'll learn that there are different types of cells within these two, but the main two types of cells are prokaryotic and eukaryotic. Now, the difference between those is eukaryotic cells have organelles, and this just means these are, if you think of as the human body has an organ and each organ carries out a specific function, an organelle would be like that in a cell, right? It's going to carry out a specific function. And these are separated from the rest of the contents of the cell by a membrane. So we call them membrane-bound organelles, meaning they are separated from the rest of the contents of the cell. Excuse me. And in addition, eukaryotic cells are usually typically larger and more complex than prokaryotic cells. Now, if all organisms then that we consider living are made of these two types of cells, we look at all of life and we can begin to divide them or group or make some kind of understanding of how we categorize them based on, at the beginning, three different what we call domains. So this would be like the three largest divisions that we say, okay, it goes into one of these three categories first. So one of these is domain eukarya, and these are made of eukaryotic cells. So these are going to have membrane-bound organelles. And as we go through, you'll see that within domain eukarya, there are 4 kingdoms that then those organisms are further divided into, and you're probably very familiar with most of those kingdoms. So one would be kingdom Animalia, which is animals, kingdom Plantae, which is plants, kingdom Fungi, which is made of fungus, and then the last maybe you're not as familiar with, kingdom Protista. The other 2 domains are both made of prokaryotic cells, bacteria and archaea. Now, for us, for right now, besides knowing that these are both prokaryotic cells and they're both single-celled, what I'd like you to distinguish is for archaea, these are what we might consider extremophiles. So these are living in very extreme conditions, whether we're talking about temperature or salinity, lots of different extreme conditions archaea can live in. Now, also, we're going to look in just a minute at the levels of organization of organisms. Okay, so in this image, what I want you to see first is at the top, we have a domain. So this is domain eukarya. This is one of the domains that we mentioned. And it shows you some examples, okay, in this domain, examples of organisms that would fall in the domain. As we get a little smaller, so in other words, we go from domain down to a single kingdom, and this kingdom happens to be Animalia, so it's going to have all animals in it. You see that, for example, the paramecium and the tree were eliminated, right? And then as we further go smaller and smaller or less and less inclusive in our grouping of organisms, the next category would be the phylum. Then it would be followed by the class, order, family, genus, and the final one would be the species. So in other words, that's one single organism's species. So in this case, the species is Canis lupus. And I want to point out to you that this is written a very specific way. This is the scientific name. It's called a binomial because it has two parts. And it's Latin, so you probably don't recognize that. The other important thing is, notice that the first word has the first letter capitalized, but the second word is lowercase. And in this situation, because it's typed, it's written in italics. If you were handwriting it, then you would underline the scientific name. Now, a couple things that I want you to see. And first is that as we go from domain down to species, obviously it gets less and less inclusive, right? The most inclusive would be domain, and then the species is very specific. Now, to keep those in order, going from kingdom all the way to species, you can use this mnemonic. There are others out there, but I use this mnemonic, and it is King Philip came over from Great Spain. So if you use the first letter in each of those, it will help you to order from kingdom all the way down to species. So now we're going to go one by one and discuss individual properties or characteristics of living things. The first that I want us to talk about is order. All living things are going to have order, even those single-celled organisms. Within the cell, there is organization and order so that cell can carry out its processes. So we know that all living things are made of one or more cells. And if we start with the smallest thing we want to identify in the cell, that's atoms. So these atoms would be elements. So if you look on the periodic table, you can see that elements are there. For example, we have carbon and we have hydrogen and we have oxygen. And as those atoms are bonded together, then they create what are called molecules. And so examples of molecules in the cell would be carbohydrates like glucose, or glycogen. We have proteins in the cell. We have lipids. And as these molecules come together, they will actually form what we call organelles, which we mentioned earlier. These are sort of like mini organs that are carrying out specialized functions in the cell. Now remember, the prokaryotic cells are not going to have organelles. Now these organelles, if they're present in the cell, come together to form the cell. And remember, this is important. This is the smallest unit of life, right? Smaller than that. So the atoms, the molecules, and the organelles would not be considered living. Now, multiple cells can come together. If we're talking about a multicellular organism, they can come together to form different types of tissues. So this example here is an example of human skin tissue. Now, we have other types of tissue. We have muscle tissue. We have nervous tissue, right? And when we have more than one tissue that come together, we have the formation of organs. So example of your organs would be your heart, right? Or your liver. When multiple organs work together, we call that an organ system. So you have a digestive system that has multiple organs, like your stomach and your small intestine and your large intestine. Then when we look at the combination of all the organ systems, that's what we consider the organism. So that would be, like us. Now, I'm going to draw a line here because that's where the individual organism ends, right? And what we would consider more a group of organisms begins. So a population is a group of one species. So for example, if you think about your backyard, A population would be all of a particular species, right, that can interbreed in this area. So let's say that there might be a population of bees, right? You may have a population of ants. You may have a population of sparrows. Each of those would make up a population. Now, the community is going to be all the living things in that area, for example, in your backyard. So all the sparrows, all the frogs, all the bacteria, right? All the fungi. The ecosystem is going to include everything in the community, right? All the living things. But what we're adding in here are also the non-living components. So what would that be? Well, so there's probably soil in your backyard or in a nearby park. And there may be rocks, right? Water, air. Those are the non-living things that would be included in the ecosystem. Finally, the largest grouping would be the biosphere. And this is essentially all the area of Earth where ecosystems exist or where living things are found. The next characteristic is responding to stimuli. And the picture you see here, I think we've probably all witnessed this in real life, and that is this plant is growing in a specific direction toward the sun. So I have some yucca in my backyard that are sort of close to my house. And because of the porch overhang, they really only get sunlight from one side. And so during the summer, I'll notice they grow definitely in one direction toward the sunlight. Now, we respond to stimuli too, and one of the most obvious is if you think about if you're cooking and you touch, a hot pan or something, you're going to jerk your hand back quickly. But bacteria, which are just simple single-celled organisms, also respond to stimulus. They can move toward specific chemicals that might be food sources, and then they can move away from more toxic chemicals. Two other characteristics that I've combined on this same slide are reproduction and then growth and development, because those are obviously related, right? In order for something to be considered living, it must be able to reproduce. Now, that's one reason that we don't consider viruses living, because they cannot reproduce without the help and machinery of the host cell. Now, some organisms are going to reproduce asexually, which means they don't have two parents, right? It's a single parent, makes a copy of the genetic material, and essentially splits in half. Animals and plants, however, undergo sexual reproduction. And either way, right, what we're talking about is the genetic material, or the DNA, is going to be passed to the offspring. Now, as the offspring grow and develop, it's the DNA that is the instructions for how that is to happen, right? The DNA codes for genes, and these genes are going to specify how the growth and development occurs. This next characteristic, adaptation, is basically talking about a living organism's ability to change, as far as the entire population, to change based on pressures from the environment, or what we call natural selection, which we'll learn about more as we go through this semester. Now, an example that I have here for you is called the peppered moth. So the peppered moth would be the common name. Then I also have the scientific name written here for you. These moths, so if we back up in history to before the Industrial Revolution, in England, the majority of moths looked like this. They had more of the lighter coloration, and that's because their habitat, their home, was a tree with, light-colored bark. So they blended into that tree with this coloration so that they prevented birds from seeing them, right, and preying on them. Post-Industrial Revolution, because of pollution, the majority of the moths had this coloration. Now, the moth, a single moth itself didn't change colors, right? What happened was, as the bark got pollution on it and the bark turned darker, the lighter colored moths showed up, right? They were easier to spot, and the birds then could prey on them. The darker colored ones blended in and were less likely to be killed. So they were the ones that survived to pass on their genes. And over time, what we have is a change in characteristics. Another important characteristic would be, you could call it regulation or you could call it homeostasis. And what this means is the ability to keep a living system in a balance, right? So it's not too, it doesn't move too far to either direction. Just a few examples of what this looks like is, if you think about us, we have to have regular input of oxygen and get rid of our carbon dioxide gas. We need a certain amount of nutrients in our bloodstream to feed our cells' needs. We also have to have a way to remove waste from our cells and our bloodstream. When you think about our ability to regulate our body temperature, we will sweat or perspire so that helps keep us cooler. Animals like the polar bear you see here have fur in order to help regulate that body temperature. And many organisms have thermal regulation, meaning we might call that warm-blooded, right? They use their metabolism to help keep their body temperature in a constant range. Now, another important characteristic, and this is another reason that viruses are not considered living, is energy processing. So all living things need energy in order to carry out whatever cellular processes they're doing. If they're trying to produce a protein or move a molecule, right? Or secrete some kind of fluid. These, or extracellular matrix, these cells need to produce ATP, which is a type of energy, in some way. Now, there's a couple of different ways that cells can do that, and the first is with using just sunlight or light energy. And this process we'll learn more about is called photosynthesis. As we go through the semester, we'll talk about this more and more. And we think about plants primarily carrying this out, but algae can also photosynthesize, and there are some bacteria called cyanobacteria that do this. Now, the next is chemical energy. And so we're a perfect example of that, right? We eat food or chemical energy in order for our body to turn that into ATP for our cells to use. So fungi we'll learn about, and protists and bacteria also. So they take in, right, chemical energy versus using sunlight. So that's the end of our initial lecture in biology, and I hope that this is helpful. I'll see you next time.